Welcome to the Monktoberfest. I have aspired to come to this event longer than I've even been speaking at conferences. So it's really a big honor for me to get to kick us off this morning. I'm super excited to be here. My name is Nick. I lead engineering at SIM, where we're focused on helping companies be more secure through just-in-time access. Come find me later if you want to talk about that, but that is definitely not why I'm here. I'm here to tell you a story. Dotted along the coast of Japan, usually a significant distance from the water, are stones like this one, left there by anonymous members of previous generations. And they all say something pretty similar. This one specifically says, "A home built high is children's relief. Remember the disastrous giant tsunami. Do not build homes below here." Now, Japan is one of the most seismically active countries on Earth, built on the Pacific Ring of Fire. These stones make it obvious that they're also no strangers to tsunamis, massive ocean waves driven by earthquakes under the sea. So, given the risk of tsunamis, you might be surprised by this map of nuclear power plants in Japan. Every single one of them is right on the coast. Now, why is that? Well, when you picture a nuclear power plant, what pops to mind? It's probably something like this. And credit to The Simpsons, this actually is a fairly accurate rendering of a pressurized water nuclear power plant. But the thing in this picture you probably most identify with nuclear power are the two hyperboloid cooling towers standing tall over the rest of the plant. Now, the funny thing about that is that there's nothing inherently nuclear about these cooling towers. Every thermal power plant needs a source of cooling, and there are plenty of non-nuclear power plants that use hyperboloid towers and plenty of nuclear plants that use other kind of coolings, like these mechanical draft arrays. The post-war economic boom in Japan meant that by the 1970s, Japan was starving for electricity. When you need to build a bunch of power plants in a hurry and on a budget, one of the best ways to reduce time and cost to build them is to build them on large bodies of water and use the water as a heat sink, so you don't need cooling towers at all. And that's exactly what Japan did over and over again. One of those plants on the sea with no cooling towers is Fukushima Daiichi, a 6-unit boiling water nuclear power plant with a generating capacity of 5.3 gigawatts, owned and operated by the Tokyo Electric Power Company. It's located right on the Pacific coast in northeast Japan. The reactors at Fukushima Daiichi went online between 1971 and 1979, all of them boiling water designs created by General Electric. March 11th, 2011 started out like any other day at the plant. Units 1, 2, and 3 were running, as they say in the nuclear industry, hot, straight, and normal, at full power. Unit 4 was offline being refueled, and Units 5 and 6 had both just finished refueling and were undergoing testing in preparation for restart. But off the coast of Japan, in the Earth's crust, trouble had been brewing for more than 1,000 years. As the Pacific plate continually subducts under the Okhotsk plate that Tōhoku and the rest of northeastern Japan sit on, potential energy is built up like a spring being compressed. On March 11th, 2011, at about 2:46 in the afternoon, that potential energy finally overcame the friction holding it back and became kinetic energy in the form of a 9.1 magnitude earthquake. The epicenter was about 45 miles off the coast, but subduction zone megathrust earthquakes like this one typically involve a rupture along several hundred miles of fault line. And in this case, the fault line that ruptured roughly parallels the coast of northern Japan. The force of this rupture was such that northern Japan moved 8 feet closer to North America, and the tilt of the Earth's axis shifted somewhere between 6 and 10 inches. It was the most powerful quake to ever strike earthquake-prone Japan. When the shaking started, Masao Yoshida, the director of Fukushima Daiichi, was in his office processing some of the paperwork that was ubiquitous in the TEPCO bureaucracy. Yoshida kept expecting the shaking to taper off, but it just got stronger. For 6 long minutes, the ground shook. When it finally stopped, he threw on his hard hat, ran out of his office, and headed toward the plant's emergency response center, where he would spend the next several days. The control room in Units 1 and 2 was in disarray right after the quake. As the shaking stopped, the operators immediately ran to the panels and started figuring out the state of the plant, calling out various measurements to Okuazawa, the shift supervisor. They were able to quickly see that the plant's automated emergency systems had done exactly what they were supposed to do. To understand what happens next, you need to know a little bit about how nuclear reactors work, so let's do a quick crash course. The heart of any thermal power plant is the heat source. In a nuclear reactor, it's the uranium fuel rods that create the heat-generating nuclear chain reaction. The fuel rods are contained in a pressure vessel and surrounded by water that, in a boiling water reactor, boils to steam. And there are also neutron-absorbing control rods that can be inserted to slow or stop the nuclear chain reaction. Now, as water boils to steam, it expands. And the energy from that expansion turns a turbine connected to a generator, and this is how the plant actually generates electricity. After the steam turns the turbine, it's directed into a condenser where it cools and turns back into liquid water, and all that heat is dumped out into the Pacific Ocean. And finally, there's a circulation pump to send the cool water back into the bottom of the reactor pressure vessel to cool the fuel and to replace the water that's turned to steam at the top. In Fukushima Daiichi, like most nuclear plants, there are sensors to detect Earth movement. When there's an earthquake, the reactor control systems automatically scram the reactor, driving the control rods all the way into the core, immediately halting the nuclear chain reaction. This happened exactly as it was supposed to in all 3 active reactors. But the fuel in a nuclear reactor gets so hot that you have to maintain cooling for several days after that shutdown to continue carrying heat away so that the fuel rods don't melt. That means that the reactor circulation pumps must be kept running. And that's a problem when a giant earthquake has severed your plant's connection to the electrical grid. Thankfully, the plant had redundant answers to the situation. Each reactor has 2 enormous backup diesel generators, just one of which provides plenty of electricity to power the circulation of the plant. These generators had all started automatically as soon as the plant lost its grid connection, exactly as they were supposed to. In case the generators failed, each control room also had a bank of lead-acid batteries to give them instrumentation and control valves for several hours. Second, each reactor had a passive cooling mechanism that would function without any external power at all. In Unit 1, that took the form of an isolation condenser. Steam from the reactor pressure vessel could be directed through a heat exchanger in the isolation condenser tank, where it would turn back into water and flow by gravity back into the pressure vessel. The isolation condenser could passively cool the reactor for 3 days without any intervention. Nobody had to touch anything in the control room. The other units had passive control system or cooling systems as well, and each of them started up automatically alongside the backup generators. Now, at this point, despite being without any external power from the electric grid, the plant was well on its way to a controlled shutdown. When the first tsunami warning went out a few minutes after the quake, the initial prediction for the Fukushima area was just 50 centimeters. It would be revised several times before the quake actually hit the shore, but never beyond the plant's 19-foot seawalls. They made a precautionary announcement over the plant's PA system that a tsunami warning had been issued and that workers should move to higher ground, but that was the extent of their preparations. In reality, the largest of the 3 tsunamis heading towards the plant was more than 40 feet high, and it was moving at 100 miles an hour. When it arrived, the operators in the windowless control room had no idea. They were shocked when one of the operators announced a new critical alarm at 3:37 p.m. The diesel generators have tripped. A few seconds later, the overhead lights in the control room went out. Then slowly, randomly, panel by panel, the instruments flickered and went dark. The constant warbling of alarms from the unhappy plant was replaced by an eerie silence. A few seconds later, Izawa broke the silence by shouting, "Station blackout!" They had no electricity at all, a situation considered so impossible they had no realistic contingency plans for it. Now, the reactors at Fukushima Daiichi are all 10 meters above sea level, well above the tsunami. The huge diesel backup generators, along with the power switching equipment and the lead-acid backup batteries, were all in the basement of the auxiliary building on the 4-meter level. They were all flooded. The operators found themselves trying to operate 3 nuclear reactors that just minutes before had been generating over 2 gigawatts of power with no instrumentation and no remote valve controls. Their immediate concern was unit number 1. In order to protect the reactor's pressure vessel, cool-down rate couldn't exceed 55 degrees Celsius per hour. About 20 minutes after the quake, they realized that the reactor was cooling too fast. The isolation condenser was actually doing too good a job, and so they began cycling the isolation condenser on and off to try to slow down that cool down. They had just cycled the condenser back off at 3:34 p.m., 3 minutes before they lost power. The passive cooling systems in Unit 2 and 3 would keep them under control for the time being, but Unit 1, because of unlucky timing, was completely without cooling. Without cooling circulating to carry heat away, all of the water in the core will boil to steam. And this causes a couple of things. First, without water to cool it, the nuclear fuel rods will melt. And second, because water expands when it turns to steam, it will turn the reactor pressure vessel into a giant steam bomb, potentially eventually exploding, spraying radiation into the environment. Now, given Fukushima's location, that could make Tokyo uninhabitable for decades. And that fact was in the back of everybody's mind. There were a few things they needed to do to get Unit 1 back under control, and they started working on them kind of all at the same time. They knew the instruments in the control room would work under DC power, so while one team began looking at wiring diagrams, another team ran outside and started opening up the hoods of all the cars, scavenging the batteries. Meanwhile, another group had an idea to reestablish cooling by using Unit 1's firefighting pipe network to route water into the core. A pair of operators headed into the dark reactor building to manually turn the 5 valves necessary to route the water from the fire pipes into the core. They accomplished their mission, making it back to the control room around 9 p.m. By 11 p.m., radiation levels at the reactor building airlock were so high that Yoshida prohibited further entry. It was fortunate that this was one of the first things the operating crew did. By 2 a.m., they had a fire engine hooked up to these pipes, and they were pumping water into the reactor core, cooling it. But water injection was very slow, and once they had some rudimentary instrumentation in place from the scavenged car batteries, they understood why. Pressure in the pressure vessel was already at 2 atmospheres, and the fire engine was really struggling to pump against that amount of pressure. Now, they knew the only way that the pressure could possibly be this high in the reactor vessel was if the fuel had started to melt. So relieving the pressure in order to get more water in was urgent. Now, thankfully, Masao Yoshida had already anticipated this and was working on the necessary permissions to conduct a vent. Now, this is exactly what it sounds like. It's venting radioactive steam from the pressure vessel directly into the environment. In Japan, the law requires that any atmospheric release of radiation be permitted by the government, and that permission needed to come from this man, Naoto Kan, the Prime Minister of Japan. Now, he readily gave permission for the vent as soon as the 5-kilometer evacuation zone around the plant was evacuated, something that was already well underway. At the plant, Izawa and his team had been working feverishly in rapidly deteriorating conditions to try to figure out how to vent this reactor. Radiation levels were now high enough in the control room that being there required wearing full-face masks with charcoal filters. And if radiation levels were that high in the control room, imagine how high they would have been in the reactor building. They had to figure out a way to vent the reactor that would have staff in and out as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, back in Tokyo, Kan had finished his middle-of-the-night emergency press conference to announce the vent, and he was livid. It was 4 a.m. He had given his permission to vent hours ago, and as a trained engineer, he knew full well the potential consequences of the rising pressure at the plant. Why hadn't the vent been done yet? The liaison TEPCO had sent to his office tried explaining the challenges that the staff at the plant were facing, but Kan decided he wasn't seeing necessary urgency from the staff. He decided he needed to go and see what was going on for himself. So at 5:30 in the morning, the day after the earthquake, the Prime Minister and his entourage were on a helicopter on the way to Fukushima Daiichi. When Kan's helicopter landed, TEPCO Vice President Takai Muto was the first to greet them. Muto remembers offering Kan a standard Japanese business greeting, something like, "It's very kind of you to come, sir." And Kan responded by yelling, "Why the hell haven't you vented yet?" He proceeded to yell at Muto for the entire bus ride to the emergency response center. And then when he got there, when he met Yoshida, the first thing he did was greeted him by yelling, "What the hell is going on here?" But rather than fight fire with fire, Yoshida calmly explained the situation in detail. And as he talked, Naoto Kan seemed to settle. Finally, Kan asked, "Well, when are you going to get the vent done? More than anything, you must get the vent done." And Yoshida calmly responded, "We are, of course, doing everything that we can. We have a suicide squad preparing to enter the radiation field now." Hearing that there were people willing to risk their lives to conduct the vent operation, ended the discussion. Despite all the distraction that it had caused, the actual meeting between Yoshida and Kan lasted less than 20 minutes. Meanwhile, Izawa's crew had identified a pathway to venting that would only require opening 2 valves. The valves were in 2 different areas of the reactor building, so they would send 2 teams of 2. Under Japanese law, workers are allowed a maximum of 100 millisieverts of radiation exposure during an emergency. So everyone put on a personal dosimeter alarm like this one, set it to go off at 80, agreeing to turn back immediately if it went off. The first crew made their way to their valve on the 2nd floor of the reactor building. It was huge, awkwardly placed, hard to turn, but they got it done and were back to the control room in 11 minutes without coming anywhere close to their limits. The second crew's valve was in a more precarious position. To help us understand, here's a photo of an under construction Mark I containment structure, the thing represented in this diagram from earlier. Their valve was in the basement of the reactor building. If there had been core damage, it was likely that melted radioactive fuel would be sitting at the bottom of the pressure vessel, creating an intense radiation field at the bottom of primary containment. As they made their way into the basement, the handheld radiation meter they carried suddenly jumped to 1,000 millisieverts per hour, the maximum it could read, so who knows how high the radiation field actually was. They were forced to turn back long before they got to the valve. It turns out their alarms had been going off the whole time. It was just so noisy in the reactor basement that they couldn't hear them. They had received doses of 89 and 95 millisieverts respectively, the first 2 workers to dose out and have to be evacuated from the site. At this point, it's nearly 10 a.m. The vent still hasn't been carried out. The operators had gone from elated at the first crew's success to despondent at the second crew's discovery. But they didn't give up. There had to be a way to vent it. One team worked to see if a portable air compressor could remotely operate the pneumatic valve, while another tried to find a different route into the basement. By 2 in the afternoon, the reactor pressure vessel was up to 8 atmospheres of pressure, just about double its rated failure strength. Things were getting desperate. Another crew was getting ready to make a run for the valve, determined to open it no matter what the cost, when they got a call from the Emergency Response Center. White smoke was coming out the top of Unit 1 and 2's shared vent stack. Slowly, the pressures in the reactor started to drop. They must be venting. There's no way they could have known it without instrumentation, but the attempt to open the valve pneumatically must have worked. They felt a tremendous sense of relief. And they would get to enjoy that sense of relief for less than an hour. This is what an off-site monitoring camera saw at 3:36 on Saturday, March 12th. Workers scrambled to put on protective gear to figure out what had happened. Their initial fear was that venting the reactor was too little too late and the reactor pressure vessel had just exploded. But thankfully, that wasn't what had happened. The fuel rods in most nuclear reactors are tubes made of zirconium alloy and filled with uranium fuel pellets. Zirconium is the metal of choice for this application because it's very corrosion and heat resistant, while also being essentially invisible to the neutrons that power the nuclear chain reaction in the core. As the core gets hot enough to melt, though, something important happens to the zirconium. It loses its ability to resist corrosion and starts rapidly corroding. And this rapid corrosion in a steam-filled reactor pressure vessel rips the water molecules around it apart into zirconium oxide and hydrogen gas. As the smoke and debris settled, this is what they saw. Given all the shaking and the overpressurization, it's likely there were plenty of places the hydrogen created by the meltdown could have slipped through. It accumulated at the top of Unit 1's control building, and all it took was one spark. The explosion blew radioactive debris across the site. It also caved in a door at the ERC, contaminating the one relatively radiation-free space they had remaining. The work of keeping Units 2 and 3 from overheating and melting down got that much harder. And the situation at Unit 3 was getting critical. The passive cooling system had been cooling the reactor since the power loss, but heat was starting to build, and they were running out of fresh water on site. So the team at Fukushima Daiichi made the call to start injecting seawater. They'd been trying to avoid this because the salt would ruin the reactor, meaning it would never generate power again, but they had to keep it from exploding. Back in Tokyo, the Prime Minister demanded that they not do it. One of a small group of technical advisors had mentioned a non-zero chance that the salt in the seawater might cause the reactor to become critical and start reacting again. In reality, that chance was minuscule and an exponentially lower risk than a steam explosion, but Khan was insistent that they investigate further before moving forward. Yoshida had no intent of complying. Before the video conference with TEPCO execs in Tokyo began, he told his staff, if they order me to halt seawater injection, I will relay the order so that they can hear me. You are not to respond, and you are not to stop seawater injection. It's our only chance. Unbeknownst to them, core damage at Unit 3 had already occurred, and if they had halted the seawater injection, it likely would have exploded. The next day, Unit 3 would experience a hydrogen explosion, just like Unit 1. Unit 4, which wasn't even running at the time of the earthquake, would also have its own hydrogen explosion from hydrogen gas suspected to have leaked over from Unit 3. Unit 2 experienced core damage as well and likely avoided exploding only because its reactor building was so damaged by the other explosions that the hydrogen gas was able to vent out instead of accumulate. You can see Units 1 through 4 in this photo. 3 of the 4 exploded, 3 of the 4 in a state of partial meltdown. At this point, radiation levels at the site were making it hazardous to walk from building to building, with staff running in protective gear anywhere they needed to go on site. So late on the evening of the 14th, 3 days after the accident, Yoshida made the difficult decision to evacuate most of the staff to Fukushima Daiichi's sibling plant a few miles away, and only keep a volunteer skeleton crew on site. Everyone who chose to stay knew there was a significant chance they'd suffer dangerous radiation exposure, possibly even die, but they felt a responsibility to the rest of Japan to make sure the plant didn't cause wider contamination. In the end, there were 68 plus Yoshida left at the plant. The media, loving a clever nickname, called them the Fukushima 50. Back in Tokyo, Prime Minister Kan hears that TEPCO plans to abandon the plant. Furious at this news, Kan calls a middle-of-the-night meeting. Now, the TEPCO liaison in his office quickly clarified the misunderstanding that there was no intent to evacuate the plant completely, but it doesn't matter. Kan is livid. He uses his authority to create a joint response office with him as the head, taking control over the response at Fukushima from TEPCO. Despite knowing that there was never any intention to abandon the plant, Kan carries on in the meeting like there was. If things go on like this, Japan is done for. Abandoning the plant is unthinkable. You must risk your lives on it if necessary. If you abandon the plant, TEPCO will be destroyed. You can run, but you'll never get away. To a room full of people who had just decided to sacrifice their lives, if necessary, to keep the plant from exploding, Kan said, "You can run, but you'll never get away." Well, at this point, Masao Yoshida had had enough. At the front of the room, video conference camera still running, Yoshida stands up, turns his back to the camera, and drops his pants. Now, he makes it look like he's just tucking his shirt back in, but everybody in the room knows what he's really doing. In Japan's formal business culture, turning your back on a superior is a sign of disrespect. And Yoshida took it to the next possible level. Now, as the plant slowly came further under control and danger became less, evacuated workers came trickling back in to help. It would take the better part of the year, but finally on December 16th, TEPCO declared cold shutdown at Fukushima. That meant that all reactors were below 100 degrees Celsius, and all radiation leaks had been substantially contained. This photo from earlier this year shows the condition of the plant today. A tank farm sprang up around the plant to contain all of the contaminated water they had pumped through the reactor cores, trying to keep them cool. Unit 1 and 2's buildings were able to be repaired, but new containment structures had to be built around Units 3 and 4. Decommissioning work has begun and will likely take several decades to complete. In the history of commercial nuclear power generation, there have only been 5 reactor meltdowns, 3 of them at Fukushima. But to fully understand the severity of the accident, let's put it into context by comparing radiation releases from other disasters. The first commercial reactor to partially melt down was at 3 Mile Island in Susquehanna, Pennsylvania. TMI's contained hydrogen explosion and subsequent venting released approximately 626 gigabecquerels of radiation into the atmosphere. Fukushima Daiichi, with its 3 partial meltdowns and 3 uncontained hydrogen explosions, is estimated to have released 780 petabecquerels of harmful radiation. 3 Mile Island is represented as a 1-pixel dot on this slide. I promise it's there. But the correct size would actually be a circle 6/10 millionths of a pixel across. That's how much bigger Fukushima was than 3 Mile Island. Now onto the worst reactor disaster of all time, Chernobyl. The Soviet RBMK reactor design famously had no containment of any kind. So when it exploded, there was nothing to keep all of that radiation from going straight up into the atmosphere, to the tune of 5.2 exabecquerels, about 7 times as much as Fukushima. But let's say the operators at Fukushima had failed to establish cooling and relieve the growing pressure in the reactor pressure vessels, and all 3 running units experienced steam explosions. An uncontained failure at all 3 active Fukushima Daiichi units is estimated to release at least 7.5 exabecquerels. But because Fukushima's reactors had pressure vessels, it's likely that would have amplified the explosions versus what happened at Chernobyl. It's almost impossible to know how bad it could have been if not for the heroic actions of Masao Yoshida, Iko Izawa, and all the others who risked their personal safety to respond to the situation. The only way the disaster at Fukushima could have been prevented was to move the backup generators to higher ground, something that, in true bureaucratic fashion, TEPCO was studying but hadn't yet committed to at the time of the accident. But once the tsunami arrived, there's very little the operators could have done better, given the information and resources they had in the minutes, hours, and days after the accident. We think of Fukushima Daiichi as a disaster, and it was. But when you look at it in context of what might have been, it was also an incredible success. So instead of learning from what went wrong, let's take a look at what went right. In a very hierarchy-driven society, in the middle of a bureaucrat's bureaucracy at TEPCO, and with the prime minister breathing down their necks, the operators at Fukushima were able to think creatively and operate decisively to bring the plant back under control. How? To understand that, we have to dig a little into how organizations actually function. This really interesting paper published by Dr. Ruth Ann Heising is where we'll start. Dr. Heising studied business process redesign teams at several large companies. Now, these teams were trying to make fundamental improvements to how their organizations accomplish critical tasks. And where each team started was process mapping, documenting the steps, conversations, tools, and other activities required to do something like process an insurance claim or launch a new product into the market. These maps always surprised the teams that created them. And they often raised existential questions, especially for people with leadership titles. The reason was that they revealed the actual structure of the organization, the relationships and information pathways that were responsible for the organization getting work done. To quote Dr. Heising, they learned that what they had previously attributed to the direction and control of centralized bureaucratic forces was actually the aggregation of work and decisions that people distributed throughout the organization made. Now, it's easy to assume that folks in formal leadership roles, many of us in this room, are in control. Some of us may have even aspired to these roles because we wanted to be in control. Dr. Heising's work tells us that control is not exactly what these roles give us. A title conveys formal authority, yeah, but all of the output of an organization happens at the bottom of the org chart, at the edges of the organization. This is where the organic emergent structure by which an organization actually gets work done exists. As a leader, any control you think you have over the what and the how is actually an illusion made up of two other things. The first is power. Depending on your role, your formal authority might give you control over people's pay, what projects they get to work on, and sometimes if they even continue having a job. This power can give you a lot of leverage in getting people to do what you want them to do. The other is influence. Influence is using the relationships that you build, the expertise that you display, and the behaviors that you model to engender trust in the people that you work with, to align them with the mission, win them to the cause. Every leader uses a combination of power and influence to get their job done, but the two tend to be inversely related. The more influence you use to lead, the less power you use, and vice versa. And I should clarify, you don't have to have a formal leadership title for this to be true. The fact that you would choose to come to an event like this tells me that this probably applies to everybody in this room. There are people in your organization that look up to you as a leader, even if you don't have the title. Let's take a look at the two leaders in this story and put them on a spectrum. But instead of using my spectrum, let's use Dr. Ron Westrom's. In a 1998 paper, Dr. Westrom proposed a typology for categorizing organizations based on how information flows through them. Is it pathological, constrained to be used as a tool to control others? Is it bureaucratic, following a set of rules sometimes designed to protect a status quo or a specific department at the expense of the whole? Or is it generative, flowing freely to advance the whole organization's goals and generate new ideas? Westrom focused on the flow of information because, in his words, information provides the glue that keeps teams focused and coordinated. In his research, Westrom found that the influence of leaders was most evident at the extremes, and that bureaucratic organizations were a sort of unfortunate default. So we're going to ignore bureaucratic for today. What are some of the characteristics that Westrom identified in pathological and generative cultures? Well, pathological leaders build cultures with low levels of cooperation by making sure all decisions flow through them. Generative leaders encourage cooperation by delegating decisions and authority to those closest to the situation. Pathological leaders tend to shoot messengers, yelling at them for not solving the problem. Generative leaders encourage messengers, making sure they learn of problems and challenges as quickly as possible so they can act on them. When something goes wrong, pathological leaders make sure they know who to blame so they don't get blamed themselves. Generative leaders aren't that worried about blame. They want to understand what's happened so that they can respond to it and learn from it. And finally, pathological leaders see new ideas as a threat. Generative leaders try to get their whole team into the idea-generating business because they know they don't have a monopoly on good ideas. Westrom found that teams with generative cultures feel more ownership and sense of purpose in their work because they trust each other. Information flows freely and they respond in times of crisis without worrying about who gets the credit if things go right or the blame if things go wrong. The generative culture that Masao Yoshida spent years building at Fukushima is the reason the operators were able to creatively solve so many problems happening at the same time. So how did he do it? Ryosho Kadota, the author of one of the books I read while researching this presentation, asked several Fukushima operators how the accident would have been different without Yoshida, and most of them answered with some variant of, "We'd have been lost without him." Several said something like, "With Yoshida in the lead, we were prepared to die together if we had to." And when asked why, it came down to trust. Yoshida made it clear over his years of leading Fukushima Daiichi that he trusted his team. They were able to make decisions, improvise solutions, work in deep harmony during the accident because of the trust that he placed in them and helped them build in each other. And Yoshida continually re-earned and reinforced that trust by doing things like standing up to the prime minister and managing TEPCO leaders in Tokyo, making time and space for his team to respond to the events in front of them. If you want to build this kind of culture among those you lead, among those you work with, it starts by embracing the idea that you're not actually in control as a leader. You're just wielding power and building influence to shape behavior and action. You have to decide where you want to land on this spectrum. And if you want to build a generative culture, Westrom's research tells us there's a pretty clear answer. And that's not to say that all power is pathological. You'll still need to use power at times, particularly around training or removing individuals that make your team less safe, less generative. But in general, leading by influence means that you lead by being worth following. You have to build trust, share context, build buy-in, encourage and motivate rather than just telling people what to do. It means actively giving your power away to those you lead, creating space for them to try things, make mistakes, and learn. Using power to lead feels so much easier sometimes. But this was the secret of Yoshida-san. He was a leader worth following. And it's not an overstatement to say that the generative culture his team built is the thing that allowed them to save Tokyo. If he could build generativity amidst the Japanese culture of extreme deference to hierarchy and the stifling bureaucracy of TEPCO, there's nothing stopping any of us from doing the exact same thing. Thank you.